When we picture the past, we usually imagine a blockbuster movie. Kings in spotless shining armor, screaming Viking berserkers shrugging off wounds, and Roman emperors draped in gold, commanding the world with a single word. But those images are largely a fiction designed to make us feel better. Empires rarely survived because of a profound battlefield speech, a dramatic single combat duel, or a legendary weapon. The actual levers of ancient and medieval power were intensely unglamorous. Kingdoms rose and fell based on raw caloric intake, the agonizing decay of the human body, and the ability to survive miserable weather. To understand how history was truly made, we have to strip away the polished mythology. We have to look at how ordinary and extraordinary people endured absolute physical misery. Take the Vikings. Popular culture paints them as unstoppable forces of nature. The reality was a cramped, freezing, and perpetually wet existence aboard a wooden longship packed shoulder to shoulder with 30 other exhausted men. This chart highlights the real enemy of any Viking expedition: math. It compares the caloric burn rate of an oarsman fighting freezing North Sea currents against the strictly limited storage capacity of a shallow draft boat. Food, not courage, dictated how far a raid could go. Which is why the foundation of Norse expansion looked like this. This is stockfish, cod dried hard by the frigid coastal air. Along with heavily salted meats, these aggressively preserved rock-hard proteins were the literal fuel of the Viking Age. A raid's success depended almost entirely on desperate logistics. If a storm delayed the ship, or if the hard bread molded, or the salt failed to keep the pork from rotting, the warriors died long before they ever swung an axe. We see a similar distortion with King Arthur. We imagine Camelot as a massive, glittering stone castle, but 5th century Britain was a terrifying, collapsing frontier. The Roman legions had abandoned the island, leaving the remaining population exposed to constant raids and systemic ruin. If a historical figure inspired the Arthur legend, he certainly wasn't a shining monarch holding court at a round table. He was likely a desperate Romano-British warlord, organizing local defenses and fighting Saxon invaders in the mud just to survive the winter. The chivalry, the glittering armor, and the magic were all grafted onto the story centuries later. Even this wooden sign at Glastonbury Abbey, marking the supposed site of Arthur's tomb, stems from a medieval marketing campaign by monks trying to attract tourists to a chaotic, fractured world. The true enduring power of the Arthur legend is the psychological memory it preserves. It is the story of a shattered society fighting off total collapse, holding the line when the world seemed to be ending. Ultimately, history is shaped by how individuals respond to extreme physical pressure. We can see this clearly by looking at two monarchs who faced overwhelming crises, with opposite approaches to endurance. In the 1st century, the Roman Empire fell into a brutal civil war. Emperor Vitellius possessed immense wealth and commanded the imperial treasury. Yet, as rival armies marched on Rome, he retreated into extreme gluttony, hosting massive theatrical banquets while the state crumbled. His total surrender to appetite rapidly bankrupted the government. Unable to endure the stress of leadership or mount a disciplined defense, Vitellius was eventually dragged through the streets and humiliated before his execution. Compare that to King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. Crowned at age 13, he ruled a highly contested medieval kingdom while his body was actively failing from leprosy. The disease slowly consumed his physical strength, destroying the sensation in his limbs and fading his eyesight. Yet Baldwin refused to hide. When Saladin invaded with a massive force, the teenage king had his attendants help him into his armor, rode out to the hill of Montgisard, and led a desperate cavalry charge that broke the enemy lines. Vitellius proves that having infinite resources means absolutely nothing without the discipline to use them. Baldwin proves that sheer, agonizing willpower can hold an entire kingdom together against impossible odds. When we look closely at the mechanics of the past, we don't find perfection. We find starving men clinging to wet longships, warlords fighting in the mud for survival, and a slowly dying king refusing to let his realm fall. The flawless heroes, the magic swords, and the golden banquets are psychological tools. They are the comforting stories later generations invented to cope with the brutal, unforgiving harshness of the actual past. But the unglamorous reality is far more impressive than any polished myth. It requires actual human suffering, deep resilience, and the capacity to keep moving forward when the body screams to stop. The true legend of human history isn't about shining armor or divine intervention. It is our stubborn refusal to surrender to starvation, disease, and the collapse of the world around us. You are exhausted, terrified, and violently slipping in the mud of a medieval battlefield, surrounded by screaming horses, until suddenly you are standing perfectly still, bathed in morning light, while a servant quietly drapes a spotless white toga over your shoulder. We tend to view history as a timeline of mathematical precision and flawless logic, romanticized through sweeping marble columns and the stoic faces of epic myths. But early human existence was naturally chaotic. These societies lacked the modern grits we rely on. There were no digital footprints, no professional police forces, and no reliable way to keep a population in line through force alone. To survive, early civilizations turned behavior into armor. They built rigid visual codes and public rituals to shield themselves from the vacuum of chaos, creating a world where breaking character meant the end of your social existence. In ancient Greece, hair functioned as a strict visual script. A single braid or a trimmed beard communicated your age, your status, and your freedom before you spoke a single word. For an elite woman, hair was a performance of civilized discipline. These elaborate, tightly controlled waves and knots announced a household's wealth and the woman's own commitment to social harmony. But this effortless elegance was an agonizing daily ordeal. It required hours of pulling, pinning, and scenting hair with oils while sitting motionless beneath the Mediterranean sun. This beauty was defined by its opposite. While the elite spent their mornings in the mirror, the people doing the actual work wore their hair cropped short, a forced visual marker of their status as property. Greek grooming wasn't about aesthetics. It was a boundary line drawn in curls and braids, designed to keep the enslaved at the bottom and the elite safely at the top. The Romans built this performance directly into the walls of their homes. An aristocratic domus functioned as a political headquarters, with long, open sightlines engineered so that the public could observe the family's wealth from the street. Every morning began with the salutio, a ritual where a patron received clients in the atrium. His toga, folded carefully according to his status, announced his rank before he even spoke, projecting an image of calm, immovable power. The theater continued into the evening banquet. These dinners were psychological minefields, where seating arrangements signaled your exact place in the social hierarchy. This leisure was powered by invisible labor. For every reclining aristocrat, dozens of slaves refilled wine cups to keep the illusion of effortless dominance intact. The stakes were higher than a simple faux pas. A stained toga, a forgotten name, or a disorganized feast suggested a loss of discipline that could cause a politician's entire network of favors to collapse overnight. Roman authority rested on this fragile daily performance, a show that could only be maintained as long as the lower class remained exhausted and unseen. On the medieval battlefield, the performance became lethal. Chivalry wasn't a suggestion. It was a rigid code that forbade a knight from ever abandoning his lord's colorful banner, regardless of the danger. Real combat was a meat grinder of mud, concussions, and screaming horses. In this chaos, following a piece of fabric into a wall of spears was often a death sentence. A knight who flinched in the mud didn't just lose a battle, he invited a total collapse of his family's standing. In a society that viewed physical bravery as the only valid proof of a noble soul, visible fear was treated as a terminal character flaw. The punishment for breaking character was a social execution. A knight might have his spurs chopped off in public, or endure a fake funeral ceremony while he was still alive, marking his honor as dead even if his body survived. These men marched towards certain slaughter because they found the social death of cowardice more terrifying than the physical reality of the blade. This obsession with performing one's role at any cost was so deep that it eventually reshaped the gods themselves. In Norse mythology, the universe begins with a death sentence. Ragnarok isn't just a battle, it's a prophecy where the gods are guaranteed to lose and existence itself is destined to collapse. The gods spent centuries watching the countdown. They saw the signs of the endless winter and the rise of the great wolf Fenrir, who was prophesied to break his chains and devour the world. Knowing he will be killed and his world destroyed, Odin doesn't hide. He raises his golden spear and rides out to meet his end. The outcome was irrelevant. The true test of a god was courage, following the warrior's code into a battle he already knew was lost. The Greek bride, the Roman senator, the medieval knight, and the Norse god were all performers. They used these strict structural codes as their only psychological defense against a world they couldn't control. These rituals provided the glue for civilization. When life was short and unpredictable, these scripts gave people a way to make their existence feel permanent, orderly, and meaningful. If the marble ruins and rusted armor of history are just leftover props from a desperate ancient performance, we have to wonder, what invisible scripts are we performing today?
History is often romanticized through waving flags and dramatic generals, but the survival of a civilization is actually dictated by cold physical mathematics. When the infrastructure of an era shatters, the outcome is decided by calories, timber, and the availability of fresh water. We think of society as a permanent structure, but it is a delicate arrangement. A city only functions because a massive, invisible network of supply lines constantly moves resources against the friction of nature and war. To truly understand the human spirit, we have to look past the battle maps and examine the moments when these logistical systems reach their absolute breaking points. This logistical defiance takes several forms: engineering resources from a void, outrunning the reach of supply lines, weaponizing the trade of a rival, or surviving a total systemic collapse. This chart of the landscape around ancient Babylon shows a flat, sun-baked desert. In this environment, keeping even basic crops alive required a massive, continuous network of irrigation canals carved into the dry earth. King Nebuchadnezzar II attempted a logistical impossibility, an elevated forest supported by mud brick terraces. He ordered his engineers to sustain heavy, wet soil and mature trees high above the dusty plains of a city that averaged over 100 degrees in the summer. To defeat gravity, the builders installed hidden mechanics within the structure. This diagram shows how chain pumps likely lifted water continuously from the Euphrates River, feeding a mechanical heartbeat through shafts concealed deep inside the terraces. Because mud brick dissolves when exposed to water, the structure required an advanced protective shell. Layers of reeds, asphalt-like bitumen, and lead sheets sat directly beneath the soil to prevent the irrigation from liquefying the garden's own foundations. Beyond the botany, the garden served as a monument to raw imperial power. Babylon signaled that its logistics were strong enough to rewrite the laws of the desert and reorganize nature itself. While Babylon struggled for water, the Norse colonies of Greenland faced a different deficit. These fjords were devoid of timber. Without wood, the colony could not build houses, craft tools, or repair the ships that were their only link to the outside world. Leif Erikson's voyage to North America was in fact a calculated logistical hunt. Reaching the forested shores of Vinland provided the timber and farmland that Greenland's icy fjords could never offer. This paradise was ultimately cut off by the North Atlantic. Every single resource had to travel this dotted line in small, open wooden boats across thousands of miles of unpredictable, freezing ocean. The fragility of this supply chain left the small Norse settlements isolated. thousands of miles for reinforcements, they were vulnerable to any resistance from the indigenous populations who already understood the terrain. Even the greatest discoveries fade into legend if a civilization cannot stretch its logistical reach far enough to protect its people. Along the Illyrian coast, a lack of resource-rich land drove the local tribes to weaponize the geography of the Adriatic Sea. They turned the rocky cliffs and hidden harbors into a base for a different kind of economy. Queen Teuta deployed small, fast ships called lembi to outmaneuver the slow, heavily laden merchant vessels of Rome and Greece. By striking quickly and vanishing into the jagged coastline, the Illyrians effectively turned the Adriatic trade routes into their own supply depot. Rome retaliated once the disruption to its trade became unbearable. The Republic launched a massive military expedition across the sea, marking the first time Roman legions moved eastward to secure the logistical flow of the Mediterranean. Logistics sustain empires, and threatening those systems carries a heavy price. By choking Roman trade, the Illyrians forced the Republic to cross the sea with an organized military force that would eventually conquer the region. Systemic collapse reveals how quickly the baseline of survival can shift. During the later years of the American Civil War, railroads were systematically destroyed and farmlands were stripped, leaving soldiers and civilians in a logistical void. The standard military ration was hardtack, a flour and water cracker baked until it was nearly indestructible. It was frequently infested with weevils, forcing soldiers to either smash the insects out against trees or eat them for trace amounts of protein. During sieges like Vicksburg, the logistics of food disappeared entirely. Civilians trapped and ate rats to survive, while soldiers boiled their own leather shoes and belts for hours, desperate to extract whatever grease remained in the hide. This photograph captures the look of a generation pushed to the edge. These men survived on parched corn and boiled mule meat, while dreaming of the ordinary roast dinners they left behind. Even as their physical world fell apart, people engineered psychological substitutes. They brewed fake coffee from peanuts, baked mock apple pie from crackers, and used imagination to hold on to a fragile shred of the civilization they were losing. Eventually, the immediate crises ended. The pumps in Babylon stopped, the Vinland camps were reclaimed by the forest, and the Civil War sieges were lifted. These events show that civilization is a thin layer, and humans will resort to desperate, improvised tactics the moment our logistical comfort is removed. Yet there is a unifying theme in these stories: the stubborn refusal to stop organizing. Whether building waterfalls in a desert or seasoning starvation soup, we relentlessly try to improve our environment. History finds its truest shape in our relentless, resilient ingenuity, the human habit of reorganizing the world, even when the world is actively falling apart. The air in ancient Pompeii carries the familiar scent of damp stone and baking bread. Marcus Lucretius is already at work, moving with practiced efficiency, sliding the raw loaves into a glowing clay oven. Outside, a small line of early customers is forming. These citizens believe today will unfold exactly like yesterday. Their habits provide an insulation against the reality that Vesuvius is already waking up. For Marcus and his customers, the rhythm of a normal morning is the only world that exists. Humans crave predictability. The natural world operates on physical laws that have no regard for our comfort, and we spend our lives building psychological walls against that reality. Ancient life was defined by chaos. A sudden freeze could destroy a year's food supply, and a minor infection could kill a healthy adult in days. Social stability shifted with the wind, often without warning. Ancient societies engineered rigid cultural rituals to manage this pressure. Routine served as a survival mechanism, a way to impose human order on a universe that offered none. This drive for control is visible at the most microscopic level, the human body. Ancient Egyptians viewed natural hair as a chaotic nuisance. It trapped heat and invited parasites, leading them to pragmatically shave their heads to eliminate the unpredictability of nature. After removing their natural hair, they replaced it with highly engineered artificial wigs.
These pieces stayed in place, never grew wild, and obeyed exact stylistic demands. These wigs functioned as wearable identity. The elite wore intricate, symmetrical braids bound in gold and topped with cones of scented wax that melted slowly in the heat, releasing perfumes hour by hour. By looking at a person's wig, an observer could read their exact wealth and social rank without a word being spoken. By standardizing their appearance through these wigs, the Egyptians achieved a level of control over their public image that nature couldn't allow. It was a rejection of biological unpredictability in favor of a curated social reality. Celtic Europe scaled this concept up to the community level. To the Celts, the unpredictability of human emotion was a threat to social stability. Marriage functioned as a pragmatic negotiation. Families calculated the exact exchange of livestock, land rights, and clan assets, viewing a union as a strategic merger rather than a personal choice. During a hand-fasting ceremony, an elder bound the couple's hands together with a cord beside a burning fire. The fire served as an uncompromising witness, and the spoken vows focused on the endurance required to maintain a household through changing seasons. The subsequent communal feast acted as a public stress test. As relatives drank and old rivalries surfaced, the community observed how the new alliance handled the friction. The goal was to ensure the contract could survive the pressure of clan politics. Hand-fasting locked two individuals inside a rigid social and economic structure, neutralizing the volatility of emotion to keep the community intact. Eventually, every society must confront the ultimate disruption: death. The Vikings met death with a high-stakes logistical operation. While grief was present, the priority was an immediate, structured mobilization of the entire household. Living companions washed the body and dressed it in fine fabrics or armor to display its status. They gathered specific tools, weapons, and sacrificed animals, packing the deceased with everything required to navigate the next world. Chieftains were placed aboard ships and set ablaze. The Vikings favored grand, fiery spectacles to solidify the legacy of the deceased, making their departure a visible, public event for the entire community. A seeress directed the transition, using chants and occasionally human sacrifice to strictly govern the movement between worlds. By turning death into a meticulously planned ceremony, the Vikings asserted an illusion of control over the ultimate unknown. While Egyptians, Celts, and Vikings successfully organized their lives, some chaos is simply too massive to be managed. Back in Pompeii, a tearing roar splits the sky. A column of ash rises fast, swallowing the blue sky. The ground shakes violently, cracking plaster walls and shifting heavy roof tiles. Even as ash coats the heavy stone grain mills, the citizens stubbornly cling to their routines. Merchants in the forum continue to haggle, and teachers maintain discipline among their students. Breaking their daily habits would require them to accept an apocalyptic reality that cannot be fixed. To Marcus and his neighbors, the safety of the routine feels more real than the threat from the mountain. This delay is a testament to human conditioning, the attempt to apply the comforting armor of daily habit to an erupting volcano. The ground jolts one last time. Vesuvius releases a surge of superheated gas and ash that sweeps through Pompeii, instantly overtaking all human effort. The noises of the city, the hagglers, the teachers, the clatter of the bakery, are replaced by a sudden, absolute silence. The victims remain precisely as they were when the surge arrived. They are locked in place under the shadow of the mountain, halted while desperately trying to endure. Across these cultures, the drive remains the same, a persistent effort to build systems of routine as a shield against a universe that offers no order of its own. Humans have a habit of treating existence like a competitive sport. If we feel an emotion, we want it witnessed. If we achieve success, we want it worn. We constantly push to the front of the crowd to ensure our status is acknowledged by others. This visibility carries a hidden cost. When we force others to notice our success, we invite them to compare it to their own lives. That comparison eventually breeds envy, turning neighbors into critics and fracturing a community under the weight of its own resentment. This raises a difficult question. How does a society, or even a single person, prevent this need for attention from tearing everything apart? The answer lies in the discipline of remaining unseen. Mastering the art of strategic restraint is a highly effective mechanism for surviving a volatile environment. History provides two distinct blueprints for this survival.
We can look at a society that legally enforced invisibility across its entire population, or an individual who weaponized that same restraint to save her life. Ancient Athens is famous for democracy, but the system was built on a paranoid fear of unchecked human behavior. They recognized that private ambition could easily escalate into public instability. This led to strict civic limits on something as personal as grief. The city dictated funeral attendance and prohibited the volume of public wailing from suggesting a person was trying to notify the afterlife of their loss. Lawmakers understood that unchecked emotion quickly transforms into a performance. If one family gathers 20 people, the next gathers 40, turning mourning into an unofficial competition for visibility. The law functioned to contain grief before it became a social event. They applied this same logic to wealth. Citizens could be prosperous, but they were forbidden from acting like walking advertisements for it. Elaborate clothing, abundant jewelry, and oversized private homes were all restricted. An oversized house serves as a permanent physical statement of dominance over a neighborhood. By forcing the wealthy to remain discreet, Athens prevented the quiet reminders of inequality that trigger societal resentment. The ultimate tool for stability was ostracism. Once a year, the city gathered to vote on whether a specific individual was becoming a problem. If a person became too persuasive or too popular, they were selected for a 10-year exile. This wasn't a punishment for a crime. It was a preemptive strike against potential tyranny. The collective suspicion of thousands could remove a person from the city before their influence could destabilize the democracy. Athens survived its own volatility by legally mandating a baseline of invisibility. They protected the collective by aggressively capping the ambition of the individual. Moving from a city to an individual, we find the same logic inside the Tudor court. This was a lethal environment, where state power was used to target those who stood out too clearly. Elizabeth I grew up under the absolute authority of Henry VIII, a man who reshaped a kingdom and executed his own circle to secure his lineage. Before she was 3 years old, Elizabeth's mother was executed, and she was stripped of her status as a princess. This loss taught her from childhood that royal visibility is inseparable from physical danger. Elizabeth responded by internalizing the principles of restraint. She survived by becoming politically and emotionally invisible, using measured silence to blend into a court that was waiting for her to slip up. Her discipline was tested during the reign of her sister, Mary. As Mary aggressively restored Catholicism, Elizabeth found herself a primary target for purges and religious suspicion. Elizabeth survived by outwardly conforming. She attended Mass and adjusted her behavior to offer her enemies no evidence of her true beliefs, providing them with zero ammunition to use against her. During Wyatt's rebellion, she was arrested on suspicion of treason and brought to the Tower of London through Traitor's Gate, the same passage that led to her mother's death. Under interrogation, Elizabeth offered perfect, calculated restraint. She answered every question with precision, never offering a single extra word that could be twisted into a confession or a contradiction. She survived the most dangerous court in Europe because she never gave the state a reason to strike. By withholding everything, she protected her life. The outcome of this strategy was eventually decided by time. Mary I died without an heir, leaving the throne vacant. Elizabeth took the throne because she was the one who lasted. She didn't rely on aggression or loud ambition. She secured power through the sheer endurance of her own restraint. Noting these examples reveals a defensive logic. In high-stakes environments, increased visibility consistently correlates with increased threat. Both the Athenian legal code and Elizabeth's silence occupied this lower quadrant, a space where safety is maintained by minimizing the target presented to the world. In a modern world that constantly demands loud public performance,
These historical blueprints suggest a remarkably different path. Power resides in the discipline of the unspoken, and control belongs to those who master the art of withholding.
In 1184, a highly influential group of men gathered in the German city of Erfurt. These were the nobles, knights, and imperial officials of the Holy Roman Empire. They owned vast tracts of land, commanded armies, and arrived draped in heavy, intricately forged armor to display their absolute wealth and power. But they were meeting directly above a massive, neglected cesspit. Right in the middle of their tense political negotiations, the rotting wooden floorboards gave out. Dozens of these powerful men plunged straight downward into the dark, confined space below. Armor is highly effective for surviving sword strikes. It is entirely useless when you are submerged in human waste. The sheer weight of all that metal, designed specifically to protect them, dragged them under, turning their own defenses into an inescapable anchor. We assume the biggest dangers in the pre-modern world were invading armies or chaotic battlefields. Time and time again, the real threat came from humanity's insistence on building massive, rigid structures that offered the illusion of absolute safety. By engineering these static, immovable displays of power, societies accidentally created environments where a single broken beam or overlooked flaw guaranteed a catastrophic collapse. Look at Beauvais Cathedral in France. The builders wanted to construct the tallest Gothic structure ever attempted, pushing walls thinner and stretching flying buttresses higher to project divine authority. They pushed past the structural limits of stone and mortar. In 1284, the building simply could not hold its own weight, and a massive section of the soaring stone vaulting crashed entirely to the floor. In medieval Paris, that same structural ambition was applied to daily life. This technical drawing shows the city's densely packed skyline, specifically the Pont au Change bridge. Instead of using the bridge strictly for crossing, city planners treated it as prime real estate, stacking heavy, multi-story wooden houses directly over the flowing river. It was considered highly efficient space management until, eventually, the wood gave way. Without warning, massive sections of the bridge snapped, dropping entire unsuspecting households straight into the rushing water below. When builders attempt to defy gravity rather than work with it, they leave zero margin for error. A failure in these heavy, over-engineered environments doesn't happen politely or gradually. It happens in a single, devastating instant. This rigid mindset extended far beyond architecture into how society itself was managed. In crowded cities like Paris, officials tried to mandate order by constructing a highly theatrical, aggressive system of justice. They relied on visible fear to keep the population in line. Thieves were locked in public pillories to be pelted with rocks, and repeat offenders were branded with hot irons in crowded town squares. Every punishment was designed to project absolute control, but physical walls and public executions offered zero protection against biological anomalies. In this medieval illustration, you can see patients suffering from intense bodily afflictions. This was caused by ergotism, a fungus that infected common rye. It hid perfectly in the daily bread supply, easily bypassing every physical defense the city had. This clash between rigid rules and biological chaos peaked in Strasbourg in 1518. A single woman stepped into the street and began to dance uncontrollably. Within days, hundreds of others joined her, driven to exhaustion, stroke, and even death by a terrifying compulsion. City authorities tried to apply their usual logic to the problem. They built stages and hired professional musicians, assuming they could cure the chaos by giving it structure. Instead, the music encouraged more movement, rapidly escalating the mass hysteria. You cannot intimidate, legislate, or execute a biological compulsion. When a strict system of control meets a natural phenomenon that refuses to follow the rules, the system itself becomes a fatal trap. The most extreme historical attempt to engineer away chaos happened centuries earlier, in ancient China. Emperor Qin Shi Huang spent his life violently unifying a fractured country, and he demanded that his absolute authority continue even after his death. He ordered the construction of a sprawling underground world guarded by the terracotta army. Thousands of life-sized, highly individualized clay soldiers were arranged in perfect, frozen military formations, requiring a brutally managed workforce to achieve industrial levels of precision. He even terraformed the underground complex to replicate his empire's geography, allegedly using liquid mercury to create flowing, highly toxic rivers that would protect his resting place. But the moment the emperor died, the iron grip he held on the surface world shattered. Revolts broke out immediately, and rebels tore into the tomb complex, looting real weapons and smashing his carefully arranged clay soldiers into the broken fragments you see buried in the dirt here. By trying to build an eternal monument of control and conquer death itself, he built a fragile system that collapsed almost instantly without its enforcer. When the Venetian merchant Marco Polo traveled across the Eurasian steppes, he expected to find heavy stone walls and imposing cities. Instead, he found an empire that looked like this: wide open landscapes and folding tents that could vanish overnight. The Mongols secured control over the largest continuous landmass on Earth by treating movement as their primary asset. They lived on horseback and adapted to the landscape rather than trying to force the landscape to adapt to them. This map illustrates the Yam Relay Network, a series of supply stations spaced out across continents. Riders carrying orders would swap exhausted horses for fresh ones, moving information at incredible speeds and completely bypassing the need for slow, static fortresses. To Europeans like Polo, safety meant hiding behind the thickest wall you could afford to build. Out on the steppe, the Mongols understood that true control requires moving in rhythm with an unpredictable environment. Resilience isn't found in rigid walls, thousands of pounds of armor, or a perfectly still clay army. When you spend all your energy trying to permanently block out the world's chaotic forces, a single crack is all it takes for the universe to break in. During the late medieval period, Europe expanded rapidly. Towns grew, trade networks reached further, and populations gathered in ways that felt like progress. But by packing human beings into high-density zones without an understanding of germs, these cities functioned as efficient engines for catastrophe. Looking at this map of 13th century London, the street grid reveals a total lack of open space within the walls. Houses were built shoulder to shoulder, families shared single rooms, and waste disposal was a public affair. They designed a scheduled transmission zone for illness. When a pathogen like the Black Death arrived at the ports along the Thames, it found a frictionless pathway into the city. The urban density allowed the disease to hitch a ride on rats and fleas, moving through the population with enough speed to wipe out a third of Europe. Further north, Viking societies largely avoided these massive, sweeping epidemics. While myths suggest they were biologically invincible, their true defense was geography. The rugged Scandinavian landscape forced settlements to remain small and separated by impassable physical distances. They also maintained cultural habits that quietly suppressed disease. These everyday tools, carved bone combs, razors, and ear cleaners, point to a systematic commitment to grooming. By washing regularly, they consistently disrupted the life cycle of parasites. Scandinavia also benefited from a forced seasonal lockdown. Brutal winters brought travel and trade to a near-complete halt. Even if an infection appeared within a household, the freezing temperatures and snowbound roads limited its ability to jump between communities. The contrast reveals a specific vulnerability in human progress. Human connection drives civilization forward, but surviving that growth requires managing the physical space between people. Out on the Silk Road, managing space was a matter of survival. The route was defined by vast, indifferent geography, where uncontrolled exposure meant falling victim to bandits or the elements. To survive this journey, merchants relied on the caravanserai. These structures functioned as heavily fortified survival mechanisms, engineered to force a necessary pause in the journey,
behind thick brick walls and single entry gates. Inside those walls, a temporary economy of trust emerged. Once the gates closed, naturally suspicious travelers could lower their guard, check their cargo, and share resources without the immediate threat of the open desert. Information became the primary currency within these walls. Away from the firelight, merchants traded rumors about bandit movements, corrupted guards, and shifting market prices. A single whispered detail could redirect an entire caravan. The caravanserai succeeded by manufacturing a temporary interruption in connection. It offered enough time to trade goods and gather intelligence before travelers closed the world out again and returned to the road. In the urban density of Roman Pompeii, the local tavern acted as the ultimate social leveler. In these narrow streets, public and private lives were packed so closely that the tavern became a focal point for the entire community. The tavern's atmosphere escalated predictably as the sun moved. Mornings belonged to laborers complaining about wages, but by afternoon, the heat and the alcohol made way for high-stakes illegal dice games. Standing behind the counter, the tavern keeper functioned as a data broker. He monitored escalating disputes and cataloged an endless flow of local secrets, knowing exactly who owed money and when to intervene. Eventually, the proximity took over. When social boundaries dissolved, arguments turned physical. Tables were flipped and cups shattered, but the tavern's enclosed architecture contained this violence, preventing local disputes from spilling onto the main streets. This localized density forged alliances and ruined reputations. Roman taverns harnessed raw human friction to negotiate the daily realities of the city. Constantinople functioned as a global filter, actively regulating the flow of goods and ideas across the empire. Positioned at the hinge of East and West, it had to manage international friction on a massive scale. The city utilized massive physical filters to prevent hyperconnectivity from overwhelming its systems. Heavy iron chains blocked unwanted ships from the Golden Horn, while the layered Theodosian walls communicated that entry was a strictly controlled privilege. They also filtered behavior through architecture. Beneath the vast dome of the Hagia Sophia, the scale intentionally dwarfed the individual. It imposed authority through presence, forcing visitors to lower their voices the moment they stepped inside. Deep inside the Great Palace, a hidden informational filter intercepted threats. A network of servants and spies tracked rumors and shifting alliances, allowing the empire to react to instability before it reached the markets. By acting as a universal valve, Constantinople avoided the catastrophic fate of other medieval cities. It absorbed the world's chaos by aggressively regulating every individual interaction. Mapping these four societies onto this spectrum reveals a specific pattern of survival. The Vikings relied on the accidental isolation of their geography, while Constantinople survived through heavily engineered, meticulously filtered integration. Both societies relied on similarly limited medical practices, but Europe's infrastructure turned that common lack of knowledge into a catastrophe. The dense urban centers provided the perfect environment for disease to outpace any available remedies. We often attribute historical endurance to willpower or brilliant leadership, but these outcomes usually trace back to the physical organization of space, the placement of borders, the thickness of walls, and the distance between homes. The civilizations that endured were the ones whose geography and architecture struck the precise balance between the rewards of connection and the safety of isolation.
We tend to walk through life assuming we are the primary architects of our own destinies. We believe that our survival, our status, and our identity come down to personal choices and individual grit. But we spend our entire lives operating inside a maze of invisible borders that we rarely notice until we hit a wall. Throughout history, who survives, who starves, and who ends up at the very top of the social hierarchy is rarely determined by personal merit. It comes down to invisible power structures. Societies survive by categorizing things, deciding exactly who receives protection, who is denied it, and what objects are allowed to have value. To understand how these invisible rules shape human existence, we can examine four highly specific historical realities: a starving outlaw in the woods,
a Roman slave under the needle, a Japanese port filtering a crisis, and a vineyard engineering absolute luxury. These examples reveal a quiet, unsettling truth. The ultimate authority of a state does not come from swords, armies, or military violence. It comes from the bureaucratic ability to script reality using labels, categories, and laws. In the medieval world, becoming an outlaw had nothing to do with adopting a rebellious, romantic lifestyle in the forest. It was an administrative deletion. When you were declared an outlaw, the legal system simply stopped recognizing your existence. You lost all rights to courts, to property, and to the protection of the local guards. This erasure triggered an immediate shift in everyone around you. Because the law no longer cared what happened to you, killing or capturing you became a completely legal way for your neighbors to gain favor or claim a reward. The local baker, the farmer down the road, they no longer saw a human being. They saw a disposable opportunity with a bounty attached. Once cut off from society's protective structure, the physical environment takes over. The forest offers no real shelter. Damp clothes pull the heat from your bones. Safe drinking water is scarce, and finding enough edible roots or berries to sustain your baseline metabolism requires more energy than you can consume. Your body rapidly begins to consume itself. The stories of merry bands of thieves sharing fires and loyalty are myths designed to make a harsh reality sound entertaining. In a lawless environment where resources are violently scarce, other desperate fugitives are not loyal companions. Every person you meet is a liability, calculating whether they would be better off if you were dead. Physical survival is virtually impossible on your own. We rely entirely on the invisible administrative agreements of a society to keep both human and environmental predators at bay. When a system wants to execute its harshest punishment, it doesn't need to attack you. It only needs to erase your legal protection. Systems also wield power in the opposite direction. Instead of erasing you, they physically force an identity upon you. In ancient Rome, tattoos were not a form of personal expression. The Romans called them stigmata. They were painful, mandated marks of state authority carved directly into the skin to convey a single message: you belong to someone else, or you have broken the rules. Slaves were routinely marked to ensure immediate identification. The ink might specify their owner's name, their origin, or carry instructions to hold them if they attempted to escape. It was a highly efficient administrative tool that stripped away any illusion of individuality and legally branded a human being as property. For criminals and military deserters, the needle served as an inescapable public memory. A thief might have their crime inked across their forehead. A soldier who abandoned their post would wear their cowardice permanently. The punishment followed them into every market and every conversation for the rest of their lives. Imposition shows exactly how far a governing body will go to maintain order. By weaponizing human skin, the Roman bureaucracy transformed temporary legal statuses, like a single theft or a moment of cowardice, into a permanent, unalterable identity that the individual could never outrun. A society can also assert control by aggressively filtering what it allows inside its borders.
During the Edo period, the Tokugawa shogunate watched closely as the Qing dynasty in neighboring China succumbed to a devastating society-wide opium addiction crisis. Japan absorbed the lesson and engineered a massive structural defense. You can see their strategy in this photograph of the harbor at Nagasaki. The shogunate bottlenecked virtually all foreign interaction through this single, heavily monitored geographical choke point. Every crate, merchant, and idea was subjected to intense scrutiny before it could touch the mainland. Opium existed in Japan during this time, but purely as a tightly regulated medicine. Because the state restricted access to the extreme margins of society, the drug never gained the momentum to normalize. Without easy availability, the social infrastructure of addiction, like widespread opium dens, never formed. That rigid containment held until the mid-19th century.
Here is Commodore Matthew Perry, the American naval officer whose warships forced the opening of Japanese ports to global trade. It took overwhelming industrialized military pressure from the outside to shatter the shogunate's filtration system. Filtration demonstrates a profound level of state power. By structuring its borders with absolute precision, Edo Japan entirely averted a social catastrophe. They didn't have to fight a war on drugs. They simply denied the threat the oxygen it needed to normalize. Finally, administrative power can take an ordinary agricultural resource and engineer it into absolute luxury. In the early medieval period, wine was often a thin, sour beverage, consumed mostly because local water supplies were highly effective at making people sick. Today, specific bottles command the price of a house. This transformation started with Cistercian monks. Look at this diagram showing how they divided these hillsides into hyperspecific geometric plots. Through decades of obsessive, silent observation of the soil, moisture, and sunlight, the monks mapped the land's behavior, inventing the concept we now call terroir. But observations alone don't create an empire. Rulers and politicians stepped in, applying rigid legal frameworks to these plots. Classifications established in 1855 and the strict AOC laws that followed locked these boundaries into the legal code. The law dictated exactly what grapes could be grown and exactly how they had to be processed. Look at the faces of the workers and children in this 1913 photograph. Upholding a legally mandated standard of absolute perfection required multi-generational, back-breaking manual labor. Entire communities spent their lives pruning vines to satisfy the precise demands of a bureaucratic classification. And the sheer physical infrastructure built to accommodate this elevated status is staggering. This cavernous, column-lined cellar looks like a cathedral, constructed with vast industrial scale, simply to house, age, and protect a state-sanctioned liquid asset. Elevation proves that value isn't simply pulled from the dirt. A ruling system can literally manufacture prestige, engineering an agricultural product into a global symbol of power using nothing but meticulous bureaucracy and the strict enforcement of the law. When we pull back and look at these mechanisms together, a clear pattern emerges. The legal erasure of a medieval outlaw, the physical imposition of a Roman tattoo, the strict filtration of a Japanese port, and the legal elevation of a French vineyard all point to the exact same phenomenon. True, enduring power rarely manifests as a king sitting on a throne barking orders. It operates quietly. It lives in the invisible architecture of borders, legal definitions, and administrative categories that surround us every single day. You can see this architecture in your own life right now. The passport in your drawer, the credit score attached to you, the zoning laws governing your neighborhood. These are modern equivalents of the exact same systems, quietly dictating where you can go, what you can own, and how society categorizes your worth. We like to think of history as a long record of individuals making choices, but beneath that, it is actually a record of the invisible systems that decided what choices those individuals were allowed to have in the first place.
We tend to think of human history as a highlight reel of grand empires and brilliant conquests, but underneath those famous victories lies a much older, far less glamorous story, our constant struggle against hostile environments. Nature doesn't care if we make it to tomorrow. A shifting climate or a sudden brutal freeze possesses zero empathy for the people trying to survive it. To see how our ancestors managed to stay alive, we have to look at how they adapted across three distinct scales of time. We are going to examine the macro scale of millennia, the predictable cycle of a single year, and the exhausting microscale of a single day. When we look closely at these timelines, we find that survival requires severe psychological tools. Humans invent memory, ritual, and routine to force order onto an entirely unpredictable world. Thousands of years ago, the Egyptian landscape was a loud, chaotic wetland. The Nile flooded regularly, supporting massive, dangerous animals like elephants, hippos, and towering wild cattle called aurochs. Looking at this map, we see how North Africa slowly transformed over generations. As the rains failed and lakes shrank, the expanding desert consumed the grasslands. The massive herds migrated south to chase the retreating water, and predators followed. The early Egyptians watched their green world disappear. Instead of simply forgetting these vanishing animals, they embedded them deep into their mythology. Crocodiles, for instance, became heavily concentrated in the shrinking river, making fetching water a deadly gamble. By worshipping the crocodile god Sobek, they attempted to spiritually manage a very physical, terrifying apex predator. Or consider the sacred ibis. As wetlands vanished, Egyptians bred and sacrificed millions of these birds. They invested immense physical effort into mummifying them, creating vast underground archives of wrapped offerings in a desperate bid for divine favor. When an ecosystem collapses over millennia, a society uses myth to keep the ghosts of their environment alive. It creates a necessary illusion of permanence, while the actual ground turns to sand. If we zoom in from deep history to a single year, the threat becomes immediate. For the ancient Celts, surviving from one harvest to the next was a tense, fragile project. This wheel represents the Celtic survival calendar, mapping phases of threat against an adversarial natural world. Samhain marked the terrifying plunge into winter, locking away resources. Opposite sits Beltane, where communities lit massive bonfires to purify cattle and encourage nature to yield crops. Standing in these physical stone circles, the Druids acted as timekeepers.
They observed the shifting light and orchestrated these communal alignments, ensuring no one faced the turning seasons alone. These bonfires and gatherings served as psychological survival tactics. By practicing seasonal rituals, they negotiated a temporary peace with a landscape capable of starving them at any moment. Zooming all the way in to a single day, the grand sweep of history disappears. For a Union soldier in the American Civil War, the hostile environment was man-made, and endurance was simply a matter of surviving the next 24 hours. The Union rationing system offered an escapable, punishing triad: heavy salt pork, dried beans, and hardtack. These calories were shipped in bulk across broken supply lines to prevent men from quietly collapsing. Hardtack was a flour and water biscuit so dense it doubled as a dental hazard. Its absurd durability proved the Army valued long-lasting rations far above human comfort.
To soften that hardtack and secure a brief moment of humanity, soldiers clung to the exhausting process of roasting, grinding, and brewing coffee. It offered warmth and a predictable rhythm in the chaos of a camp.
On a micro scale, grand myths fade away. Survival relies entirely on the mechanical routine of consuming awful food, gathering around a fire, and forcing the body to march another day. An Egyptian priest carving a lion into a temple wall, a Celtic farmer lighting a winter bonfire, and a Union soldier boiling coffee in a tin cup are all participating in the exact same human project. Faced with environments that offer zero guarantees, humans refuse to sit as passive victims. We actively build systems to process our reality and carve out a space to exist. We use art to remember what we've lost, communal rituals to cope with what terrifies us, and strict daily routines to endure what we cannot escape. History reads like a record of what happened. Ultimately, it is the story of human ingenuity, forcing meaning and life into the harshest, most indifferent landscapes on Earth.
Imagine standing in a Roman street 2,000 years ago. Nearby, a stone fountain is running. The water isn't dripping or struggling. It is surging smoothly upward, fighting gravity, before confidently splashing back down. When we see something that looks impossible, whether it's water climbing into the air, a flawless marble statue, or an empire spanning a continent, our brains want to assume magic. We want to believe that whoever built it somehow bypassed the laws of nature. But history's greatest architects and rulers didn't break the rules. They studied them with uncomfortable intensity. They measured, tested, and pushed physical and human limits until they understood exactly how things behave. They harnessed reality. To see how this works in practice, we have to look past the Roman fountain. Miles away, hidden in the hills, engineers built a massive network of carefully graded channels and towering aqueduct bridges. Over dozens of miles, they dropped the elevation by just a few centimeters at a time, moving water slowly and patiently downhill. When they encountered a deep valley, building a bridge would take years, so they used an inverted siphon. This diagram shows how they routed a sealed pipeline straight down one side of the valley. As water fell, gravity forced pressure to build. When it reached the bottom, that massive pressure pushed the water right back up the opposite slope. The math here had to be exact. At the bottom of the valley, the internal force straining against the pipe was immense. If the walls were cut too thin, the water would split them open and flood the countryside. If they were too thick, Rome wasted expensive materials and labor. Even when the water finally reached the city, it was moving with far too much violent energy. Left alone, it would blow out the local plumbing. Engineers directed it into a castellum, a heavy distribution tank designed to force the water to spread out, lose its momentum, and calm down before entering the streets. You can see the intense physical constraints in the surviving hardware. The varied thicknesses, heavy lead walls, and precisely sealed joints show how engineers calculated the exact tension required to contain the water's force. The final result, a calm, rising fountain in the city center, was actually a rigidly maintained machine. It proved to every citizen that Rome could dictate the behavior of nature itself. We see the same calculated mastery in the Renaissance. In Florence, a massive, ruined block of marble had been abandoned for decades. Two sculptors had already tried and failed to carve it. Michelangelo looked at the giant and treated it as an engineering problem. He spent years applying strict anatomical discipline to the flawed stone. He chipped away exactly what he needed to uncover David. Look at the veins on the hand, the tension in the muscles. He organized raw rock into an alert, calculating figure. Florence placed it outside their seat of government as a clear warning to larger rival cities. This success earned him the attention of Pope Julius II in Rome. Julius forced Michelangelo into a medium he hated, fresco painting, to decorate a massive ceiling. Refusal was not an option. For 4 years, Michelangelo stood on wooden scaffolding. He tilted his head at unnatural angles.
Wet plaster dripped into his eyes while he painted at a grueling pace, knowing that if the plaster dried before he finished a section, the mistakes were permanent. The Sistine Chapel ceiling is a twisting visual system of humanity and divine consequence.
It contains hundreds of massive bodies straining across the vault. We call this divine inspiration. In reality, Michelangelo engineered human emotion and theological awe through an agonizing display of physical discipline. That same mechanical discipline applies to geopolitics. The Mongol Empire stretched across continents. They didn't hold that vast territory together entirely with cavalry. They stabilized it using the architecture of arranged marriage. A bride chosen for a Mongol prince didn't experience a romantic journey. She spent weeks crossing the steppe in a highly visible procession. Every stop, every interaction was watched. The journey tested her endurance and broadcast the political weight of her family to the lands she passed through. When she finally arrived at Kublai Khan's court, there was no room for spontaneous emotion. She stepped into a sequence of formal receptions where every bow and layer of silk communicated strict hierarchy. If you look at this schematic of the wedding feast, you can see how it functioned. Seating arrangements mapped out exact loyalties. Who sat where, who drank with whom, these were carefully engineered nodes of alliance. The entire wedding was a piece of diplomatic technology. Kublai Khan used human relationships to balance rivalries and keep his empire from collapsing inward. We can even see this mechanical approach applied to the human soul. In medieval Europe, the church used physical geography to organize internal belief. Walking the Camino de Santiago meant crossing entire countries. It meant pushing through thick mud, sleeping wherever space allowed, and dealing with exhaustion for months. The brutal reality of the trail stripped away a pilgrim's wealth and status. It reduced their life to a single task, walking westward. Strangers fell into rhythm together, forming a collective obedience to the demands of the road. When they finally reached the city of Santiago, the architecture completed the process. The massive cathedral received their exhausted bodies and